Last week, as we concluded, we were talking about some inadequate explanations for the problem of suffering. There are some sorry explanations that are given for the fact of suffering. Last week we talked about this first one. Some have denied its reality. Now, I said we don't need to spend any more time with that one because it's so foolish. Anybody can see that that does not explain the problem of suffering. Tonight we begin with the second one. Some have said that suffering is always punishment from God. Now, that is wrong, of course. Every time a person suffers, it does not indicate that he has sinned and that his suffering is because he has sinned. And there are some people who have the idea, though, that if they have suffered in any way, it's because they have sinned. I know a man that I have known since he was a teenager. When he was about 18 years old or so, he was in love with a young lady, and she broke off the relationship with him. Now, when I was young, we would say she culled him. If a young man broke off from a young lady, we say he culled her. So she culled him, and it broke his heart. And he said to a nephew of mine, "I don't understand why I'm suffering this way. I haven't done anything bad in a long time, and I've been trying to do good." And his idea was that because he was suffering, because this young lady had broken off from him, that he must have sinned in some way, but he did not know why. But that's the idea that many people have. If they suffer in some way, it must be because they have sinned. I'd like to point out the fact that all suffering is not because we have personally sinned. Now, all of us have sinned, but our suffering is not always because we have personally sinned. It's true that God has punished some people because of their sins. In Genesis chapter 6, you remember that God brought the flood upon mankind and wiped out a number of people. Some people say perhaps 25 million people. We don't know. But it wiped out all but those 8 people. And in chapter 19, you remember that God brought down fire and brimstone upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their sins. In Leviticus 10, verses 1 and 2, we read that 2 young men offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. They were suffering because of their individual sins. But every time we suffer, it is not true that we have sinned and that suffering came upon us because of that particular sin. The story of Job shows that all suffering is not because of that person's sin. Turn to the book of Job, if you will. I've indicated that we'll refer to that book several times this quarter. In Job chapter 1, verse 1, we read, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil." And then verse 6 beginning, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil?" Did you read that description? Think about the type of person he was. There's none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. Now, this man was apparently a very good man. Now, who said that about him? His mama? You would have expected his mother to talk about him like that. That's generally true with people, isn't it? If the police come to the door and say, "I'd like to talk to your son about a particular crime that was committed," and mama says, "No, it wouldn't be my son, couldn't be my son," and we fathers feel the same way, you see. Sometimes we are blinded to the faults of our loved ones. We just overlook those things. I heard a story a number of years ago about a man who came upon a friend he hadn't seen in many years. They began to catch up on their lives. And this man said, I am now married to a perfect girl. And the man said, are you sure she's perfect? He said, yes, absolutely perfect. And the man said, surely she's got one fault. He said, no, she doesn't have a fault. He said, now you know nobody's perfect. Surely she has one fault. And the man said, well, maybe she does cuss a little too loud when she gets drunk. Now that's the way we often do it, isn't it? We overlook the faults of those we love. You would expect Job's mama to be saying those things about him, but it was not his mama. Who was it? It was God who said it. He was a good man. And when God says you are a good man, a perfect man, you can count on it. And yet Job suffered greatly. We talked about his suffering a little last week. You remember the story of Job. He suffered greatly, but it was not because of his sins. Now, some people then say every sin is related, or all suffering is related to some sin. Well, that's not true either. In the case of Job, it was not true. That suffering didn't come upon him because of his sin or anyone else's sin. Now, we've pointed out the fact from Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and 3 with it, that suffering came into the world because of sin. All suffering came into the world because of sin. But a person may suffer not because of his own sins, not because of a sin, but because suffering came into the world originally. Now in Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, Paul said, be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Now we often say, you will reap what you sow. Now what does that mean? If you do something bad, sow to the flesh, then you're going to reap something bad. If you sow something good, you're going to reap something good. We will reap what we sow. In my reading, I ran across a story of a man who was out hunting, and he found a buzzard's nest that was sitting on her nest, and that buzzard left the nest, must have smelled a dead animal somewhere, and he went to get something to eat. And he decided he would get some of the buzzard eggs from that nest and take them home. His wife had a setting hen at home, and he thought it would be funny to put those buzzard eggs in that nest under that hen. So he took them home, and without telling his wife about it, he slipped them under that hen. A few days later, he asked his wife how those eggs are doing. He said, are they hatched yet? She said, no, I got tired of fooling with those things, and I scrambled them for your breakfast this morning. Now, I think there's a scripture that might fit that. Be sure your sins will find you out. That's the idea of reaping what we have sown. It is true that sometimes people suffer because of some particular sin. Smoking, for example. I know you're going to say fools rush in where angels fear to tread. But when a person smokes and he destroys his body, that's wrong. Where would you go in the Bible to find a scripture that teaches you that you ought not to smoke? 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20, is that right? What? Know ye not that your body is a temple of the Holy Ghost, which ye have of God, and you're not your own? For you're bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are God's. Now when we smoke, we can destroy our physical body. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, tells us that every year nearly 500,000 people die from smoking. Therefore, we ought not be doing that. Now, the same thing can be true of drinking. When a person drinks, he can destroy his mind and destroy his body. But somebody may say, well, I don't drink enough to get drunk. Well, what is drunk? When are you drunk? Is it when you have 0.08% of alcohol in your blood? That's what the state says when you're drunk and shouldn't be driving. Is that where God says you're drunk? or is it when it affects your mind, your thinking? And doctors and scientists who really are honest in the matter will tell you that when you take that first drink, it affects you. It affects your thinking. Dr. Melvin Nisley, who was the head of the anatomy department at University of South Carolina, years ago said that when you take that first drink, that one drink can destroy 10,000 brain cells. 10,000 brain cells. Now, you may say, well, that's not too many. When you consider the fact that you have billions of brain cells, that may not be too many to you, but it affects you. With that first drink, you don't reason as properly as you should. And the next time you drink, you destroy 10,000 brain cells. And it keeps on. It's cumulative. And after a while, it really affects you. Did you know that they cannot use the bodies of dead drunks as cadavers to teach the medical students the proper function of the brain? Because that alcohol has destroyed their brain. And therefore, that's not something the Christian ought to do. I'm prepared to tell you, if you give me an opportunity, that you ought not to drink at all. You ought not take a drink at all. And so sometimes when we do things like that, we may bring suffering upon ourselves. A person may engage in sexual immorality and contract a social disease. And he may die as a result of it. He may die of AIDS. He may use a dirty needle in using drugs and contact AIDS. And he may die as a result. We can bring suffering upon ourselves. Now let me hasten to add that we ought not to assume that a person has been immoral sexually, or he has been using a dirty needle and using drugs because he has AIDS. There have been some people who have had AIDS when it was not their fault. Some years ago, there was a famous tennis player, what was his name? Arthur Ashe, who had a blood transfusion, and that blood had the blood of a person with AIDS. He contacted AIDS and then died. But he had not been immoral. That's not how he caught it. And so let's not assume that a person has sinned morally or in taking drugs, and that's why he has AIDS. But it is possible for people to contact some disease like that because of sin. It is true that sometimes suffering is the result of sins that we have committed. But not all suffering is the result of one's sins. Now, you think about a little baby that dies. Has he sinned? Is he suffering because of his sins? Obviously not. My wife and I had a little baby who died in infancy. But I don't for a moment think that that baby died because of his sins. Don't believe that baby had any sins. And sometimes you'll hear some preachers, particularly denominational preachers at funerals, say, well, God took him, and we ought to yield to God's will. Well, I don't believe that God took him. I don't believe it was God's will for that baby to die. And we need to be careful in assigning a reason like that to it. Babies die, just like older people die. And it's a part of living, just as being born is a part of living. And a little baby may die when he did not sin. Now, the Bible deals with this question. Does a person suffer in every case because he has sinned? Turn to John chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. In John 9, Jesus and the apostles came across a man who had been born blind. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifested in him. That man was not suffering because he had sinned or because his parents had sinned. There was another reason. In Luke chapter 13, beginning with verse 1, there's another answer to that question. There were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And Jesus answering said unto them, Suppose ye that these Galileans were sinners above all the Galileans, because they suffered such things? I tell you, nay. And that word nay means no. But except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. Or those 18 upon whom the tower in Siloam fell, and slew them, think ye that they were sinners above all men that dwell in Jerusalem? I tell you, nay. But except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. And so Jesus is saying, these people died, but it was not because they were greater sinners than somebody else. That's not the reason some people suffer. And there are other passages that deal with it, but I think that would be sufficient. Now, I'd like for us to think about some real reasons for suffering. I'd like to submit to you 4 underlying principles for suffering. These principles can help you to see why there is some suffering in the world. The first of these principles is the regularity of the law. Now, when God created the world, He set into operation all of the laws that would govern this world and the universe. And there are some laws for this world that are not workable in the atmosphere and other places. But God set into operation these laws that would govern this earth. Now, for example, the Lord taught in chapter 1 that everything would bring forth after its kind. In the animal world, horses would produce horses, cows would produce cows. And that, of course, teaches that the theory of evolution cannot be true. In the vegetable world, corn seed will produce corn, watermelon seed will produce watermelons. Everything would reproduce after its own kind. God intended that these laws of the universe would govern this universe. And without those laws, it would be impossible for us to live here on earth. But it is precisely because of these natural laws, sometimes suffering comes to mankind. For example, there's a law that says the sun will cause the water in the ocean to evaporate. It comes up and forms clouds. Then there is a law that says the wind will blow it up over the land area. And then there's a law that says it will fall upon the earth in the form of rain. That's how God causes the earth to get the water it needs. But then sometimes it can cause floods. But sometimes man is the reason it causes floods. I'll explain that more in just a few moments. Sometimes these laws may work together to cause a tornado or hurricane or floods, and man may suffer. Now, the most difficult question to answer in this realm is, why do we suffer because of these laws of nature? Now, we can understand why some of them might cause us suffering. For example, the law of gravity. Now, you couldn't live here on earth without the law of gravity. The law of gravity causes you to be drawn to the earth. If you fall out of a tree or off the top of a building, you don't fall upward, you fall downward. That's the law of gravity. You've seen pictures of some of our astronauts in spaceships or the space station out in space, and they'll be up here in the air, not standing down on the floor, like they were just lying up here on a bed, but they're up here, you see. That's because the law of gravity doesn't work up there. It works here on earth. And if we violate that law of gravity, we can get hurt. And we can't blame God for that if we violate that law. If you climb up into a tree and then fall out and fall to the earth, you may get hurt. But you can't say, Lord, why did you do this to me? I had a friend down in Groveland, Florida, a Christian, good man, principal of a school, and he was also superintendent of education in that county. He was up on a ladder working on his roof, and he fell off the ladder and hit his head on concrete and died. The law of gravity was violated there, not intentionally, but it was violated, and he died as a result. Sometimes gravity can hurt us though it is a good thing. We wouldn't be able to live here on earth without gravity. But man sometimes violates the law, sometimes when he doesn't mean to, and he gets hurt as a result. Or you consider fire. There are certain principles that work together to create fire. And fire is a good thing. For thousands of years, people used fire to warm their bodies or cook their food. And still many people do it. But you see, fire sometimes can cause suffering if man is careless with it. You remember the great fire they had in California just a few months ago. Many houses were burned. A number of people died. Thousands of acres of forests were burned. Now that was a violation of the law of fire. Somebody may have thrown down a cigarette that was lighted, or they might have left fire or embers burning when they had a campfire, and it might have caused a fire. It is possible that it was caused by human beings. But lightning could strike a tree or a building of some sort and might cause a fire. Sometimes people suffer as a result of such things as gravity and fire. And then sunshine and rain are good. What would we do without sunshine or rain? And yet sunshine sometimes can cause droughts, and rain can cause floods, and we can suffer as a result. Do you remember hearing of the Johnstown flood? I used to read about that thing and hear about it now and then, but I didn't even know where Johnstown was until I went to Johnstown, Pennsylvania to preach in a meeting. I preached in 3 meetings there now, and I know more about that flood than I did. After going there the first time, I bought the book about the Johnstown flood and read it. Now, when we went there for the first time for a meeting, some of the members took us sightseeing. They took us to downtown Johnstown, and we found that it was surrounded by mountains. And Johnstown was sitting there at the bottom. There was a stream that flowed from the top of a mountain, and it would flow downhill until it hit a river down here at Johnstown. But there were some rich men who bought some land up there near the top of that mountain, and they built an earthen dam to dam up that stream that normally flowed down to the river. They dammed it up, and that stream gradually built a lake there. And these rich men built their mansions around that lake. And so they were the cause of the lake being there. But they had built it with an earthen dam. In 1888, a great rain came. And instead of just soaking into the earth as God intended for it, much of that rain fell into that lake up there, and it began to rise. And some of that water flowed over that earthen dam and washed out a little bit of it, and then more flowed over and washed out more, and the first thing you know, the whole dam broke. And all of that lake flowed right down the mountain, right into Johnstown, and killed 2,100 people. They took us downtown and showed us where there were markers up on the buildings showing how high the water was there. You see, some people might say, God did that. A flood did that, so God did it. God didn't build that lake up there and stop up all that water and make a lake that flowed down into the city. Man did that. So sometimes these natural laws are violated, and as a result, man sometimes suffers. And so the first underlying principle is the regularity of the law. The laws of nature are perfect. They work when they ought to. Scientists can predict when there will be an eclipse of the sun or the moon 100 years in advance, because they know these laws work precisely with regularity. They work the same here in America as they do in Russia. And sometimes suffering comes because these laws are violated. Number 2, there is the freedom of man's will. When God created man, He created him with the ability to choose. He can choose to do this or he can choose to do that. And because of that ability, man would sometimes choose that which is good, but sometimes he would choose that which is bad. And as a result, then he brings suffering upon himself and mankind. When God created man without ability to choose, this lifted man above the level of animals. Animals can't choose as human beings do. Animals don't have a mind that can reason and choose between right and wrong. They work by instinct. When a big lion awakens from his nap one day and he's hungry, he doesn't ask, well, what am I going to eat today? Am I going to eat a man or am I going to eat a deer? Instinct tells him he needs to eat. And if a man is nearby, he'll get him and eat him if he can. Or if he can catch that deer, he'll eat him. But an animal does not have that reasoning power as human beings do. And sometimes mistakes are made by men because they have that ability to choose. And when God made man with that ability to choose, he lifted him above inanimate objects. Man is not a rock. A rock doesn't have a mind. It cannot reason. And so a rock is not going to decide to do something that will hurt him. But man can reason. And he sometimes makes decisions that will cause him suffering. Now, sometimes we blame God when we suffer, when we ought to be blaming self for the decisions we make. When man makes decisions and causes suffering, man is responsible for it and not God. Man is not a robot. Now, man can make a robot to do certain things. If you go out to visit the automobile plants, you'll see they have some robots. The robots do some of the things that men used to do. But man has to control that robot. He turns them on and off. Man is not a machine. Man makes a machine and man controls it. He has to turn it on or off. Man is not a puppet. Have you seen someone who has strings on his fingers, reaching a puppet down here? If he moves this finger, he can move the legs. He can move this finger and move the arms of that puppet. He controls what that puppet does. Man is not a puppet. He's not controlled by God or by any man like that puppet is. Man himself chooses what he is going to do. Now, we've seen that men sometimes make the wrong decisions. When I was preaching in Atlanta, there was a woman who would come to see me for counseling occasionally. Sometimes she'd come and then she wouldn't be back for several months, and then she'd come back again. And every time she came, she had some big crisis. The first time she came in to see me, she had been arrested for shoplifting. She said, I've been in prison before for it, and I was in a store with my mother today, and she took some things. When we left the store, she was caught, but I was blamed for it because I had been in prison for shoplifting. And she says, now I may have to go back to prison. I can't go back to prison again. So we had to deal with that. Another time she came in, and she was talking about committing suicide. Somebody backed into her car down in the parking lot. I said, that's no big thing. That happens all the time. You can live through that. Her freezer had stopped working, and all the food in the freezer had spoiled. And there were several things like that, and she said, I'm just going to kill myself and get out of it. She always had some crisis. The last time she came to see me, sometime later, she was crying uncontrollably, crying and screaming and saying, why did God do this? Why did God do this to me? When I got her calmed down enough to tell me what was wrong, she said that her husband was flying a plane loaded with drugs from Colombia, South America. You know that would be illegal drugs. And when he flew back into South Georgia, the plane crashed, and he was killed. And she was blaming God with it. Why did God do this? Why did God treat me this way? But God didn't do that. His decision did that. He chose to bring those illegal drugs into America and ruin the lives of many people. Airplanes crash, especially those small ones. Human beings sometimes make mistakes as pilots, and planes crash. But it was his decision to fly that plane loaded with drugs into America. So God didn't do that. But that's an illustration of the fact that sometimes people suffer and then they say God is responsible for it, when man makes the choice. Now, the Bible teaches that we're responsible for our own actions. We're free moral agents, and we must give an account for the decisions that we make. In spite of the charges of some people, God is not responsible for some or even most of the suffering that people experience. Most of our suffering comes because of the decisions we make. Stop and think about it. You think about the suffering that you have endured. You may find that some of it is because you've made a wrong decision. A woman married a man who beat her and mistreated her, and she suffered greatly, and she blamed God for it. She blamed God for her suffering. But who was responsible for that? She chose that man to marry. That was her decision, you see. A man ran into a car, a drunk ran into a car and killed a little baby, a child about 1 year old. Did God do that? That was a decision on the part of that man who drank and drove. God didn't do that. And so the second principle we need to remember is the freedom of man's will. Man can bring suffering upon himself by making the wrong decisions. Now, when God made man with the capability of reaching the stars, He also made him with the capability of plumbing the depths. Man can reach the stars, man can land on the moon, but man can also go to the depths of depravity and suffer as a result. The third principle we need to remember is the value of imperfect conditions. Now, this particular point is so important that I'll mention it again because I want to impress it upon us that we might really understand that some suffering is really good for us. There is value in some suffering. Sorrow and suffering help us to develop principles that will help us in character and prepare us to go to heaven when we die. What about patience? Will suffering help us to develop patience? It can do that. When you suffer in a certain way a long time, or with this one and then something else, it takes patience. I read the story of a lady, an elderly lady, who called the police department and told them, "I need some help." He said, "What's wrong?" She said, "There's a skunk in my basement." And he said, "Well, let me tell you what to do. Get some bread and leave some bits of bread in a trail up the stairs and then down the hall to the door, and then leave home for about an hour." Well, she did that. About an hour, she came back and called him and said, "I need some more help." He said, "What's wrong? Did you do what I told you and put those bits of bread along a trail to the front door?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then what's wrong?" She said, "Now I have 2 skunks in my basement." Sometimes that's the way it works with us, you see, with our problems. So we have one, and before we can turn around good, we have another one. Or we can't solve this problem. But you see, we need to pause and look at that problem and say, how can I use it? What can it do for me? Well, sometimes it can help us. It can create in us a recognition of the fact that we need God. Not only can it help us learn patience, but it can cause us to realize we really need God. It causes us to look to God for help. And then sometimes it develops strength in us. You know, if a person never has to overcome any problem, never has any unfortunate thing to happen to him, never has to overcome something like that, he's not going to be very strong. But when you overcome things like that, you're stronger. It helps develop our spiritual strength. Do you remember when Paul wrote about his thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians chapter 10? And Paul prayed to God about it 3 times, and each time God said no. And then in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, God said, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Then Paul said, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." What did he mean when he said, "For when I am weak, then am I strong"? What did he mean? Right. That is right. He recognized the fact that he needed God. He leaned upon God. Then he's strong. Remember that Paul said, "If God be for us, who can be against us?" Romans 8:31. If that's not it, just read the whole book. It'll do you good. Paul is one who could rejoice in these things. Even when he prayed, God said, "No, not going to remove that." But he depended upon God. He leaned upon God, and then he was strong. You see, when you suffer and you lean upon God, you take it to God and try to do His will, you're stronger than you were. So suffering sometimes is good for us. How does a boy get stronger to play football or to run in a track meet? By sitting in a hammock all summer and drinking lemonade? Or does he become stronger by getting out there and cutting grass, or plowing a field, or perhaps going to the weight room and working out? You see, that's how he creates greater strength. Now, we have a weight room down in the neighborhood where I live, and there are 18 pieces of equipment in there for you to use. And I've been in there at times. It's been a while, though. I was talking to someone recently, I think Alan Norton, about exercising. I said, I get up in the morning and I run 6 times around the block. Then I kick the block back on the bed and go on back to bed. That's the way I exercise now. But I've been in that weight room at times walking on the treadmill. And I walk. I don't run, I walk. But I've seen some in there running on that thing. I mean really running and really putting themselves into it. And there have been times when I've asked someone doing that type of thing, are you exercising just for the fun of it, or do you have a plan to run in a race? And they have said, I'm going to run in a marathon. You don't decide to do that the day before the marathon. You decide a long time before and you run and run. That's the way it is with a boy who wants to play football or run in a race. He runs until he's tired, and then he keeps on running. What's that expression? No pain, no gain. You work until you feel pain, but you keep on working. That's how you build your physical strength. That's how you build spiritual strength as well. When you suffer and you work at it and you overcome it as much as you can, you take it to God in prayer. And after a while, you're going to find yourself growing spiritually. You grow spiritually as you overcome those things. Well, those who are not children of God sometimes get their first view of God when they're suffering. Have you ever noticed that? There are people who are not interested in their souls or in Christianity until they suffer. I can tell you about a man who was not serving God at all. He was far from it. But his wife died. And then it shook him to his bootstraps. And he talked to me and asked me what he needed to do to bring his life into harmony with God's will. Never had thought of it until that suffering came. Well, sometimes suffering is good for us. Discipline is good for us. Our time is up, so I think I'll wait right there because I have a little more I want to say about that. But the value of imperfect conditions needs to be realized. It'll help us, strengthen us. We have the right attitude toward suffering, If we use it properly, it can make us better people, stronger people.